But what you can do is make sure that there's policy clearly available and in place where people can then seek support if something like that happens. What's important is transparency so that people know what they're coming into. Whose girlfriend do you even think I am? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, looking around.
Hello and welcome back to Sound Advice. I'm joined this week by Ella Fradgley from Where Are the Girlbands. How are you, Ella?
I'm good. I'm very excited. I feel like we've already been diving into some topics before we press record.
I was just saying that we probably should have press record 10 minutes earlier because we had having a really interesting conversation. But yeah, we're going to talk a bit about your organisation, Where Are the Girlbands.
Yeah.
So for anyone who doesn't know, what is Where Are the Girlbands?
So Where Are the Girlbands is a Liverpool-based organisation representing local women in music, but more generally opening conversations about accessibility and safety within regional music spaces. And we do that through a different range of ways. So we're mainly Instagram based, and we do social media campaigns, we do features, we do interviews, but we also do collaborative events, we do fundraising, and we do podcast series. And yeah, our aim is basically to provide a platform for people of marginalised genders in the local music scene, and whether that's promoting new singles or sharing their experiences, we just want to be kind of a vessel for them to share.
Yeah. So like, what inspired you to start Where Are the Girlbands? Sort of, was there like a moment where you just thought like the music industry needs this?
Yeah. So Where Are the Girlbands was founded in 2018 with me and my co-founder Eve Machin. At the time, we were in a band, and we're both from Liverpool, both growing up in Liverpool, going to gigs, being in the local music scene. And we had a few kind of difficult experiences at gigs, and just generally found it quite difficult to almost like picture ourselves within the local music scene. I think actually the scene's evolved quite a lot over the past couple of years since we started in 2018. There's been a lot of other organisations kind of similar to us that kind of grew in parallel. And so there's been a lot of initiatives to make the scene more inclusive since then. But at the time, there was, I think, like less visibility generally around women in music, and also just like, you know, a lot of the topics the podcast covers, like how to get promoted, how to have your music heard. And when we were going to these gigs, we felt just like made to feel quite small, and like had a lot of, you know, issues with confidence from that, and just generally felt like we couldn't name many women on the local scene. All the gigs that we were going to see had the same lineups, the same bands, mainly all boy bands, also like very limited genres as well. Like it was all very much indie music that we were seeing, and we were making kind of like electro experimental music. We just had no idea like where we would fit as like two women making that kind of music on the scene. And so we made the project kind of to fill our own knowledge gap at the time and find other women in music, and just to share our experience and ask other people what their experiences have been, because we were sure if we'd had those experiences, probably other people were having them as well.
Yeah. I think, just to pick up on something, I think that genre point's really interesting. Because I think I don't know, in my experience, I feel like that's something that's almost been used to justify it.
Yeah.
Where, like, I think I've been told at certain points that, like, well, there's just more male indie bands, and indie's what sells and stuff like that. Do you think that's a big part of the problem then?
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny because there are loads of women making indie music. I think probably like in terms of the genre that we end up representing, indie is a huge proportion of that. I think that's a lot to do with Liverpool's music scene historically. Also like the capacity of venues, like a lot of venues are either like voluntary run, or people are bringing in kind of like people who are promoters are like also doing the sound. So indie gigs are like one of the easiest to put on. So if people are making more experimental music or have full like jazz bands, there's less kind of experience with putting those gigs on. So I think out of ease, a lot of musicians tend to lean towards that indie electroacoustic type style to get promoted and to be seen. You know, if you want to start with open mics, you kind of have to start with a guitar or a keyboard. You know, it's hard to rock up at an open mic with like a saxophone, like people don't know what to do with. So I think that is a big part of it. But you know, in Liverpool, I think there's never an excuse to have a lineup that's not diverse. There's so many people. There's so many people coming in every year through Lipper. Every single year, there's like literally tens more people who are making really interesting music. But I think generally promoters put on what they're comfortable with, and that's where the issue lies.
Yeah. Just like while we're on it, I kind of want to give a shout out to I don't know if you've seen that Georgia Patoli's running that new Pop in the Pool, which just started, which I think is like a really good way of like helping them, because I think it's something I hadn't really noticed before, because when I played in bands, I've been sort of playing more in the indie genre, but like you really don't see a lot of pop getting promoted, especially because I think in Liverpool there's a real tendency to like that a band has to be a band and be raw and have guitars and stuff, whereas like there's nothing really wrong with like having a backing track, for example, which I feel like it's kind of looked down upon and kind of suppresses other genres. Does that make sense?
100%. I've actually just written an article about this for Liverpool Music City.
Very good. Where can you find that?
So it'll be on their website, but it's specifically about the conversation I've had with Georgia about Pop in the Pool, because like if you think about Liverpool, like Liverpool is the pop city. It's where the genre of pop is born. Like the Beatles, hello, do you know what I mean? So the fact that pop is so neglected here just feels like such a shame. Like, you know, I think the legacy of the Beatles has become 4-piece indie boy bands rather than progressive, interesting pop music, which is really like what made the Beatles so successful, is what they were doing differently. And like pop as a genre is looked down upon when, you know, people are starting out. You can't have full-scale productions, you can't have backing dancers necessarily, like you can't have musicians performing. You know, if you're someone who produces your own music, there is so much time that goes into those backing tracks. It's like people think you're coming on stage with like a karaoke that you found on YouTube, and not something that you've like, you know, had a lot of skill, a lot of time invested in producing.
Or maybe paid someone to produce, and that's the cost.
Exactly, and it's like, you know, there's been a real investment in that. And if you were going to see a gig in an arena, you would not question for 1 minute like the legitimacy of that person who's performing. So I think a lot of that actually is to do with access and finance. You know, if you can't afford to pay for a full band to support you as a lead singer, then you look down upon by promoters because you're coming in and you've got a laptop and you've got a backing track that you want to put on. And just generally, like, I think with pop music, the audience of pop music tends to be young teenage girls. It's like Harry Styles fans, all of these sort of things. There's a lot of baggage that comes with pop music, like a lot of eye rolling, a lot of like, you know, it's not real music, even though pop music is really often at the fore of what is happening culturally. It's popular music. Do you know what I mean? Pop is always evolving. It's not, the pop music of today is nothing like the pop music 20 years ago. It's a genre that is constantly iterating for the needs of what people enjoy. So it's definitely a neglected genre, and I think again in underfunded scenes where people can't afford to like put on high quality productions, those artists get left in the dust. And if you can't build your CV locally, you're never going to get to a point where you can go to, you know, a label and say like, you know, here's my experience, here's my gigging experience. If the only experience you've got is like one open mic where you turned up and you had your laptop plugged in and it wasn't really coming out of the speakers properly, you know, you're immediately behind in terms of your career.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think generally because pop is more commonly sort of solo artists. Yeah. And generally when you see pop artists in this city specifically, I almost always see them playing with a band. Yeah. And sometimes they're lucky and they've just got friends who just want to play gigs and be along for the ride. But often that's going to be costing them a lot of money. And often when promoters don't pay very well, that then means that you're maybe losing money on gigs or barely breaking even. Yeah. And I think it's a really great project. And I think it's also interesting how it's funny how genre gets like reframed, because like obviously the Beatles, everyone now like they're sort of considered indie or rock or like alternative, but they were a pop band in the 60s. Like they just were. And it's just funny how like we've kind of reframed it in my mind to think that the Beatles are closer to like the Arctic Monkeys than they are to Dua Lipa.
Exactly, but it's like if you think about the Beatles fans in the 60s, it's all teenage girls. Like Beatlemania is no different to like the people you see in like pink feather boas going to Harry Styles concerts. Like it was treated with eye rolls in the 60s, and if you read a lot of the reviews that they had when they were first, you know, breaking into America, it's very similar to the way that people talk about pop musicians today. You know, people thought they weren't making real music. They thought that they were like basically just eye candy for teenage girls with their like silly mod haircuts. And so, yeah, I think, you know, the way that we think about genre and the way that we think about who is a valid artist, a lot of that is to do with bias. It's to do with, you know, that thing of like, is it going to sell? The fact that people put on indie because they're like, it's what sells and not popular music. It's like, what do most people listen to? Music, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think sometimes the fear is that with pop, people will only listen to the bigger acts, whereas with indie, people will listen to the smaller acts.
Yeah.
But I think maybe it's true, but maybe it's an excuse at the same time. Because I think it's often a reason that people don't try it.
100%. And I think a lot of the pop music that's being made, especially in Liverpool, is incredibly alternative. Like most of it is kind of like genre breaking. You know, if you look at artists like Lazy Girl or Amber J, they really sit between indie and pop. Like the music that they make is leans into like ambient music. It leans into kind of more like rock, like heavier, grungier sounds. So to put all pop artists in one bracket even and be like, oh, they're not, you know, people won't listen to them.
Yeah.
It's such a shame. It's such a shame.
It really is. Let's go back to Where Are the Girlbands a little bit, because I feel like we've had a very enjoyable but very long tangent on pop music there. What were sort of like the initial goals or like aspirations for like Where Are the Girlbands? Like, what did you want to do with it?
A lot of it was just knowledge sharing. So, you know, again, similar to the aims of this podcast, there was a lot of grey areas, I think, in terms of our knowledge that when we asked other people, they also felt like, you know, they didn't have clarity over how to get paid, how to get promoted. And a lot of the issues that women in music face intersect with a lot of the issues generally in smaller music scenes. So things like negotiating pay. If you go to a gig with a promoter and an experience which has been shared almost unanimously across the women that we've interviewed is being ignored at sound check or being asked if you're someone's girlfriend, basically treated like you're not on the lineup. If you have a gig experience where you may as well have just been an audience member in terms of the way that you're treated by all of the members of staff at the gig, the level of confidence you then have to ask about pay after the gig is like zero. Like you feel like you've got no foot to stand on. And so we really wanted to basically like make a page where people could share their experiences, give advice. And from there, it kind of snowballed into something which is almost like functions as a directory for local artists.
Yeah.
So we really wanted to like platform and share and get to know different women on the scene. But in doing so, kind of acted almost like as a space for consultancy for promoters, for venues who want to have interesting and diverse lineups. So, for example, if you are a promoter and you're like, well, there's just not women like making this music, our page is like, yeah, there are. Like, they're right here. Like, the question, where are the girl bands, is ironic. It's like, there are loads of girl bands.
And they're here on the page called Where Are the Girl Bands.
Exactly, like, they're literally right here. We've done all the work for you. Come and have a scroll through. You can have a read of a review of their music. You can listen to an interview that we've done with them. And, yeah, there's like, you know, and if you can't be bothered to scroll through the page, give us a message and we'll send you some tailored recommendations. Like, you know, we really just wanted to serve as a platform for those conversations to take place between women, but just generally in the music scene. And I think like it goes for all forms of discrimination. Often they're happening through jokes, through unconscious bias. You know, I think a lot of the time people view misogyny as like a really intentional, like, you know, I mean, often, and it can be, or like, you know, harassment in a gig space, which is also incredibly prevalent. But a lot of the times it's like little things that are said to people that build up over and over and over again. Things that people might have said and not even realise that they've said or not done intentionally. And, you know, really well-meaning people who are like causing people to hit these like really big walls in the industry. So yeah, just like shedding a light generally on what people can do to make their venues more inclusive, to make their lineups more inclusive, and setting a precedent really in the local scene for really simple fixes to make spaces safer and more inclusive for artists, but also gig goers as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're 100% right, because I think, just as an example, like when my partner comes back and like tells me about something that she's experienced, it's like the majority of the time it's not that someone's called her a bitch or something. It's that like there's just little things, especially like in like a gig context. I think the girlfriend thing's happened a few times. You mentioned that there are some fixes. I kind of wanted to touch on that. Like the term safe space is sort of thrown around quite a lot, but what do you think a safe space actually looks like?
Yeah, so safe spaces is something that has been super important to Where Are the Girlbands. And it's something which I think, it's kind of like a term which gets thrown around, but there's not actually ever much advice given. So, I think that also is something where promoters or venues can be like, I know we need to be a safe space, but like, actually like don't know how to do that. I think something that's really important is that you can't be a safe space for everyone. So people's needs often contradict each other. So, for example, some people might want to have a drink before a gig. That eases their anxiety. That's something that makes them feel safe and comfortable. For some people, they need to be in a sober environment.
Yeah.
So that's like one really easy example of where people's safety needs contrast each other. So I think something that's really important to notice, no one's asking you to be 100% perfect and to get everything 100% right for everyone. What's important is transparency so that people know what they're coming into. So an environment is safe if you know who's going to be there, what the venue's going to be like, what are the policies. So that's a really big one. If an incident happens at a gig, what happens? Is there security involved? Is there someone that you can report to? Because at the end of the day, like, you can put on a safe space gig and you can have an audience member who comes into the gig and does something terrible. And that's not your fault as a promoter. There's nothing you can do to control every single individual's behaviour. But what you can do is make sure that there's policy clearly available and in place where people can then seek support if something like that happens.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think one of the problems that I've found, I've been on some gigs before, and I don't think anything bad happened, but I remember thinking about it at the time where I was like, if something went down here, is this my job or is this the venue's job?
Exactly.
And it's kind of like, well, it's the venue's job because we're in their space.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know where anyone from the venue is at the moment. Like anyone who isn't like working on the bar. And I don't think it's probably going to be the barman's job. So like, I think there's sometimes like not an awareness of like where the responsibility is.
Exactly. And then if you as a promoter don't know that information, how do your artists know that information? How do the audience know that information? And so that's like the main thing that we say to people is just be transparent. Just let people know what the policy is. So for example, like loads of venues in Liverpool aren't wheelchair accessible. And there's not much a lot of those venues can do because a lot of the buildings in Liverpool are historic. So, you can put on a safe space event and you need to say to people beforehand, this venue is not wheelchair accessible. So someone's not going to arrive for the gig and find that they're not allowed in. That's where the barrier lies, where you think that a space is for you and you turn up and it's not. And no one's even bothered to tell you like, hey, we haven't got this thing in place for you. So I think just like, having conversations with the venue that you're working with if you're a promoter, understanding what are the steps, who's responsible for each thing. A big thing that often comes up actually in terms of people's negative experiences with live music is security themselves. So a lot of the time venues will have kind of like external security companies working for them and there's no kind of like conversation or even like level of responsibility held if like a member of security staff lashes out at an audience member or I've been putting gigs on before and I've had security say really like not very positive things to me, and then I'm at a point where I'm like, why would I then trust the security with my audience? Like I don't feel safe with the security. How am I then expecting the security to like be looking out at the audience and thinking, oh, that fella over there looks like he's saying something a bit dodgy? I think I'm not going to have that trust in them. And the audience members aren't going to have that trust either. So just having clarity about what your processes are, who people can go to if something happens, and just generally like what your expectations are of people in the space. So if you have a lineup of musicians, just generally like having an understanding of the interactions that you want those artists to have with each other. With your sound engineers, like, you can have representation on the stage, but if the women that you're bringing on stage are having an awful experience with the sound engineer, they're not having a good experience at your gig, and that's going to show, and that's then part of that they're not going to want to work with you again. And so even if women have opportunities to perform, they're not necessarily safe opportunities to perform, or opportunities where they're even able to perform to their best ability. You know, if you're in a sound check and the sound engineer is saying to you, like, I know this better than you, love, like, don't bother. Your sound setup's not going to be right for when you perform.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, there's like all of these little barriers which add up.
Yeah.
And it gets to a point where, you know, on the surface, maybe you think that you're putting on like a really cool, safe gig, but actually there's been loads of these little horrible interactions that people have had to face, which, you know, you can solve by having, you know, hiring a female sound tech. You know, if you want to have an all-women lineup, think about who's working at the bar, who's working security, who's working behind the scenes. And if you can't have women in all of those roles, be clear about the fact that there aren't going to be women in all of those roles with the people who you're bringing on. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, a safe space is a transparent space.
Yeah.
And a space where you can ask questions of your promoter and you can say, is this happening? What's the situation with the pay? You know, there's this channel of conversation that's open, and you as the performer don't have to, like, you know, break into those conversations.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way of putting it, that a safe space is a transparent space.
Yeah.
I think you were touching on it at the end there, but I think one of the big problems, and this goes for live stuff, but it goes for stuff generally, is that there's just not enough women in stuff like live sound tech, or that are working as promoters, or that are like studio engineers. Especially, I mean, last week I was speaking to Hannah Broderick, who's runs Women in Live Music, which is sort of more about like the sound tech community. But I think one of the problems is that you're not surrounded by women in most environments, and then that can lead to you feeling probably quite isolated, I'd imagine.
100%. And, you know, it's one of those things where the conversation about inequality in the industry begins as early as school. You know, it's the instruments or the subjects that you're encouraged to take up. Like, if you look at an orchestra, it's usually all girls playing the flute, and then you have 3 lads like banging the drums at the front of the room.
Yeah. And,
you know, that then influences the whole rest of the industry, like all the way up. And it's like, it's what a lot of people who are programmers at festivals say, is that, you know, there's a lot of, and you know, rightfully so, there's a lot of attention on lineups and how many women are on the lineups. But what a lot of those promoters will say is, like, we're doing this based on numbers from the charts. We're doing it based on audience projections of, like you say, who's going to sell. So a lot of these issues are really systemic and start really early on.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to things like music technology, that's something which is 100% begins in education. And that a lot of that, I think, is to do with role models. So if you're at school and you're thinking about doing music tech, is that a course where it's going to be you and then all lads and a male teacher, and you're going to feel uncomfortable? And, you know, there was a recent report from Parliament about misogyny in the music industry, and there's lots of really interesting testimony and statistics in that about how within education, not only is it like a weighted and a gendered subject, but a lot of women in those courses experience harassment and assault, not just from their peers, but also from educators themselves.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you might even have all intentions to go into that career, and then you find that you've made it to university and your professor's actually like putting you in a position where you're not safe in the classroom. And so a lot of that is, you know, projects like that one, or, you know, there's like Saffron in Bristol who offer spaces for women and people of marginalised genders to learn those skills. You know, sharing that knowledge, I think, is the best thing that can possibly be done to kind of level the playing field there. Like, when institutions themselves really still struggle with these issues of inequality and harassment, when you have these kind of like grassroots-led spaces where you can go and almost have like no pressure and like no sense of shame with like starting from the beginning and saying, like, I don't know how to do this. I want to be able to produce my own music. I want to be able to, you know, be the sound tech at the gigs that I put on. You know, I've got a limited budget. I'd love to be able to like set up a rudimentary sound system. When you've got those grassroots spaces where not only you can go and learn without judgment, but you can see examples of people who are doing it and who are doing it successfully, that makes all the difference.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking about this last week as well, but education is a really interesting point because, first of all, like I've done a music degree. I didn't do live sound modules, but I've heard from people that did, not on my course, on a different course, but I've heard from someone that did that they sort of felt like they'd go into the room and sort of the men would have the confidence to sort of use the equipment and like be like, what does this do? What does this do? And they would feel like they were taking up space. And they essentially said that they did like sound tech modules at their uni, but didn't really learn how to like use a sound desk. And it goes in so many things. Like Hannah was saying last week, that like she wanted to do music tech, but was encouraged to do English, stuff like that. And there's especially on my course at uni. I mean, I won't name any names, but I've had women speak to me about like certain lecturers in certain ways before. So it's definitely a huge problem with education, and that's ultimately where it all starts.
Definitely, and it's the same as like, you know, to do with putting on a lineup. The amount of women who are in a space doesn't mean anything about how accessible it is to them, because you're not getting the same experience. Like if you go to a gig and you can't have your sound set up right, your performance isn't going to be one that justly represents you. And the same goes for education, like you say. You can be in a room with the equipment, but if you don't get to actually touch the equipment, then like you may as well not be in the room. And the same goes for jamming, actually. I think that's like also a really important thing, that like jam spaces are really important for learning for musicians. You know, it's where you learn to speak the language of music with other people. You know, it's the same as anything. If you're learning French, if you're learning Spanish, you need to become a native speaker. If you're a musician and you have no one to play with in that same way, you're isolated in your experience and in how you learn to exist and to perform and interact with your instrument. And again, that starts at school. It starts in practice rooms, like who has access to the equipment, who's invited to go and like pick up a drumstick and have a bash on the instrument, like, and then it's you know, it's also an issue with genre. Like, you know, if you're at an open mic, if you're at a jazz night, for example, the way that those kind of jam spaces operate is 100% to do with confidence and 100% to do with who feels like they deserve to be on that stage, who feels like, you know, they want to be heard, and also the level of critique that you'll receive for your performance. So that's that was something as well that recent report really touched on, was how women who do play kind of masculine gendered instruments, or who are involved in you know, masculine studies like sound engineering, the level of critique that they face is much higher than their male peers, because they're singled out as like a woman in that field. It's something you see a lot with female DJs. So Girls Don't Sing, for example, amazing local DJ group, have like completely skyrocketed into success. If you look at the comments on any of their YouTube videos, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments from people going like, if she didn't have big boobs, she wouldn't be on this show. All of them, literally. And it's like nothing about the mixers, nothing about the content that they bring in, nothing about the work that they do, and you know, for young women, or not even just women, but just generally like making these spaces more accessible. You know, with sound engineering, a lot of it's about access to tech, and the same goes for production. You know, you need to be able to access the software, you need to have a laptop that you can use, all these different things. So there's loads of barriers, and the issue is when you get there, you might have jumped over all of these hurdles. You've got to this final position where, like, you know, you're performing a set, and then all anyone wants to talk about in the comments is like, she's got big boobs. It's like, do you know what I mean? It's like, even when you get there, even when you manage to jump over all the barriers, the way that you're actually received is undermined, and it's critique that your male peers just wouldn't ever receive.
That's so true with critique. Like, my partner's had a lot of comments about like, oh, you're a really good drummer for a girl, and like, oh, I didn't know many girls play the drums, and just sort of like, thanks. That's not a compliment. You think it is, but it's not. And that it touches on what you were talking about before, where like, not the first one, but the second one, when people have said like, oh, you don't see many female drummers, I think that's intended to be a compliment. But it doesn't feel like one.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, people who say those things are well-meaning, and like, you know, they want to see more female drummers a lot of the time. But what it means is that, you know, again, it's opportunities for learning. So if you're a male drummer in a band, after your gig, you get to speak to people about the music. You get to receive critique that's actually to do with what you've been playing and performing. That's an opportunity for learning that women in that position completely miss out on, because all of the conversations are taken up by people talking about the fact that they're on the drums and they're a woman. It's like, you know, there's no opportunity there for you to even just like engage as a musician about your own experiences and, you know, enjoy being there with a band. And, you know, it goes all the way through the live music experience, from turning up and, you know, not getting a wristband because people think you're someone's plus one. Like, that's an experience I've had before. You know, when I've been at an event on my own with an instrument, and it's like, whose girlfriend do you even think I am? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, looking around. And it's that same thing where, like, you know, in that moment where someone's looking at you and thinking, like, and just seeing girl, basically, not seeing drummer, not seeing performer, just seeing woman. There's no opportunity there for you to talk about your music, for you to network, you know, for you to form those relationships with promoters, with other musicians, with people in the audience. And these are the kind of, like, small unnoticed things that really build these barriers and prevent people from being able to accelerate in their careers in the way that they should be.
Yeah. Let's move on to the slightly more positive side of it in terms of where the girl bands are doing and, like, that side of things. Just to start with, like, how does Where Are the Girl Bands provide a platform for female creatives?
Yeah, for sure. So my background, I'm a musician, but my kind of, like, professional background is in the arts and in marketing. So I think, like, a really big part of musicianship today, unfortunately, is self-promotion. It's something that, you know, whether from being at uni, but just generally, like, a lot of the advice you get as a musician about how to accelerate in your career is to do with how you represent yourself online, how you know, perform on social media, all of these different things. And so on a really simple baseline level, we provide a platform where we create interesting content about musicians that gives a flavour of the music that they make, that introduces them to a new audience, that connects them with promoters. And that's, I think, one of the main ways that Where Are the Girl Bands functions as an organisation, is as a connecting point. So, you know, whether you're a new musician coming to the scene and you don't know which promoters to work with, you don't know which venues to go to, we can offer advice to musicians and vice versa. If venues really want to put on, you know, they're like, I really want to put on an R&B gig, but I don't know any women in the genre. That's where we can come in and we can say, okay, here are, like, 15 different women who you can look at, and then there's kind of no excuse for their lineup to not be diverse and interesting. And we basically kind of act as that person in the room who, like, says your name and, like, you know, puts you forward and represents you and hopefully pushes you in the way to opportunities, and gives you that audience to share your music. So that's kind of like, on the side of platforming women in music, we do that through reviews, interviews, consultancy, but we also offer a platform for people to share their experiences and kind of be validated in the way that they've navigated their careers, and be able to share advice to other people in the industry and make them feel like, you know, you mentioned isolation before. I think that's a really big part of it, and it's why we started Where Are the Girl Bands, was because we felt incredibly isolated in our experience and we didn't know who to go to, who to talk to about it. And so that's what the platform acts as. It's a space where people can hopefully feel represented, feel heard, find the information that they need to find in order to progress locally. And then, you know, every now and again we have, like, a project where, you know, maybe we can have, like, some people performing at a live event. Maybe we have, like, a podcast with, like, specific information. Like, we did a Safe Spaces podcast, which the whole intention of that was what you were saying before, giving people actually the tools to make their spaces safer. And just a space for people to share and to find information, as well as to be promoted for the music that they make.
Yeah. I really love the side of it where it sort of cuts out a lot of the excuses that you hear as to why women don't get given opportunities. Like, I just don't really know any women in this genre, or, like, I don't know, especially, like, indie is, like, a big one. And then it's just sort of like, as you said, like, Where Are the Girl Bands? They're there. Yeah. They're all there. Yeah. You can see them, and it sort of cuts out that common excuse, which I think you hear, like, with festival lineups as well, and all sorts of stuff. Sort of, how do you think the local scene needs to change?
I think that the local scene is changing and has been changing. So when we started in 2018, there was a lot less, I think, you know, sort of targeted support for making the scene inclusive, full stop. There's been a lot of initiatives that have sort of come up over the past couple of years, which are really exciting to see. But I think generally just having an open mind, and something that I'm really conscious of is generally the lack of funding and the lack of finance that people have in Liverpool. As venues, you know, people are scared of putting gigs on that won't sell. And so, you know, there's real serious, like, especially when we see venues closing all the time. We see, like, you know, Melodic closing recently. You know, you see, even like when Bidolito shut its doors, you see these like huge powerhouses having to close their doors for financial reasons. I completely sympathise with why people feel like they don't want to, like, what for them is taking a risk on artists that they don't know. And so I think a lot of what we aim to do in terms of supporting the local music scene to change is prove that these artists have audience, have people who care about their music, are really high quality artists that deserve to be represented, and have the tools basically to make their venues better, make their lineups better without feeling like they're having to take on the risk. And like you say, a lot of it is labour as well, like, you know, finding those artists to put on, finding sound techs who are of marginalised genders. A lot of that takes a lot of time, and people don't have a lot of time. So I think, you know, use the resources that are there. It's not just us, like, there's loads of other organisations. There's Bitch Palace, there's Black Lives in Music, there's like organisations like Noir Gaze who are putting on events which showcase different artists. I think really use all of the resources that are there and who are doing the work for you. You know, try and avoid those excuses. People sympathise with you. People know that it's financially tough. Everyone's financially struggling. Most of these organisations are voluntary run, but really do use and listen to the voices who are telling you how you can improve your spaces.
Yeah, just to throw another one in there. There's Music Scene, who create the list of female creators working in Liverpool every year on International Women's Day. So just shout out to them as well.
Yeah.
I was going to talk about like what you talked about, that like the scene is changing and it is definitely getting better, and I've certainly noticed that myself. I think even since moving to Liverpool a few years ago. But what like specific changes would you like to see, sort of maybe in the local scene, but also maybe like in the broader music industry as well?
I think that transparency that we were talking about before is a huge one. I think venues having clear safe space policy is something that's really easy to implement and would benefit everyone. It benefit them. It means that if something happens at their venue, they have like something to refer to for their staff, and if there's an incident that takes place, it doesn't negatively reflect on them as a venue. It's something that they can deal with. It allows promoters to be able to run their events more safely at their premises. That benefits audiences, it benefits musicians. So I think, investing in having a policy is something that is a really easy fix that I would love for most venues to have. I think more generally, like, having these kind of educational knowledge sharing spaces, like what you're doing, like what, you know, tons of sort of grassroots spaces are doing, is amazing. You know, the first step to having a more diverse music industry is having a music industry where people have the confidence to perform and people have the confidence to even pick up an instrument for the first time. So, you know, having those kind of like trailblazing examples is huge. You know, people who are from marginalised backgrounds who are like being amazing, being successful. Like, I think that's something that Girls Don't Sing are incredible for, is that they have shown people that like you can really do it. Like, you can really like skyrocket with your career, and that, you know, having that representation is huge in terms of giving people the confidence to take the risk. And, you know, being a musician, being a sound tech, being anyone involved with the arts, it feels risky. It feels like, you know, a financial, like, you know, jump into the deep end. So seeing examples of people who are doing it successfully is huge as well. And if you are a venue, if you're a promoter, you know, taking those small risks and at least putting one person on your lineup, you know, even if you've got a headliner who you know is going to be super supportive, put someone on the lineup who you've not represented before. Don't just keep regurgitating the same 4 bands over and over and over again. And yeah, you know, it's hard. It's really hard to give a clear list of things that need to change, because so much is just deep rooted in schooling, in people's interpersonal lives. You know, to have a music scene that is like inclusive and safe, you need to have like a whole society that's inclusive and safe, really. So as much as there are kind of like touch points and examples like policy that I can give, I think just generally like being open to like learning, finding resources, you know, acknowledging as well your biases. Like, it's something that's really important to me as well, is that Where the Girlbands isn't a platform where it's just about me and my experience. Like, I want to be a space where musicians of different backgrounds can share their experience. Like, as much as women in music are underrepresented and disadvantaged, black women in music are more disadvantaged than white women are. You know, if you're talking about pay gaps, for example, black women on average get paid 25% less than white women do. That's it. You know, it's huge, and it's really important that almost like, because you've ticked one diversity box, you don't feel like you've done all of the work, that everyone is willing to like look back at themselves, look at their events, always being really willing to improve and to listen to the experiences of other people. And, you know, it goes back to that transparency. Like, if someone offers you critique, take it as learning and take it as something positive that is going to improve your organisation, is going to improve your career as a musician, as a promoter, as a sound tech. It's something that is going to benefit you as well as it's going to benefit them, and it's not a negative thing to learn and to make spaces more inclusive for other people.
Yeah, it's a great answer. I mean, I think you're right that like at a certain point, unless you can rip out society and start again, you can't change everything. But I think there's also, that's not an excuse, because there's plenty of things that you just said and a lot of them, as you said, are quick fixes. There's things that can be done very easily to make the music industry and the local scene specifically a safer space for women and all marginalised people, really. Just to wrap things up, sort of, what are your plans for the future with Where Are the Girlbands? Where's the organisation going?
Yeah, exciting. So we've got some gigs on the horizon coming up for this year. I can't give the details of them yet because they're not fully released and confirmed yet, but we're planning on putting on some more safe space events in Liverpool, which is really exciting. We also have our own podcast being released, potentially might be released at the point of this interview going live. If it's not, it will be coming very, very soon.
If it is, it will be linked in the description as well.
Amazing, thank you. So if you've got suggestions of people who you want to see on the podcast, let us know. If you want to be on the podcast, let us know. Love to have you on there. And just generally continuing our work in terms of representing local people in the music industry, keeping those conversations ongoing. And so if you're a musician, whatever level you're at, not even if you're a musician, if you're someone who's working in the music industry in the Northwest, we want to support you, we want to represent you, we want to be a vessel for you to share your experiences. We really don't have any level of criteria for the people that we put on our page. You know, you cannot have a single demo released and we will still feature you and talk to you and offer you advice. So, you know, our page is there for you. Give us a DM, give us an email. And yeah, we'll go from there and see what happens. Yeah,
do that, because Where Are the Girlbands are great. And like, they're an organisation that I've sort of, when I first came to Liverpool, they were really sort of one of the, like, bastions is a big word. I never used the word bastions before. But like, you know what I mean? You're one of like the big, like, you feel like one of the big organisations now that people can like look to and that people can sort of take inspiration from. And I mean, we could, if we started talking about role models, we could record a whole nother podcast. But like, you were mentioning role models there, and I think it's so inspiring to female artists in the city, and certainly female artists that I've met and spoken to, that they can sort of, there's a place where they can see that they're not alone and there's other people doing it. So
thank you.
You're great, basically. Where Are the Girlbands are great, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.